Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Senate Room again on this fine summer's evening. And so good to see so many of you. Pro-Chancellor, ladies and gentlemen, this is a rich time for the university. Some 13 professors will give or have given already inaugural lectures from now to the end of the year. So we are celebrating some fine new professors. So in welcoming you, let me mention a few people. The chances that every time I mention some, I'll forget others. But very important on occasions like this is the family of our professors. So it's lovely to have Mrs. Brennan and her daughter with us, which is welcome, special welcome. We also have many guests from the other universities near us, guests from the University of Liverpool John Moores. We have representatives with us from Child Bereavement, Shirley Potts, old friend and colleague from this university. Welcome back, Shirley. And representatives from People First, Merseyside. Very welcome. And let me also welcome President and Mrs. Stephen Fogarty, the president of Alpha Crucius University College in Sydney, a faith-based institution in Sydney with long ties with the place. And President Fogarty is passing through town and is joining us tonight, and will also later on have fellowship with members of the university. So very welcome, everybody. As I said, this has been a great time of celebrations for new professors. And as is our custom, the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research, Professor Naga, will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor, and good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to introduce our inaugural lecturer, Professor Michael Brennan, and I'm very pleased to welcome him to the university's professoriate. Professor Brennan, our professor of sociology, is an internationally recognized authority in the sociology of death, dying, and bereavement. He has over 100 publications, which include books, book chapters, peer-reviewed journal articles, research reports, articles in educational, clinical, professional, and practice-driven publications. Over the last 25 years, as a result of his international reputation in the interdisciplinary study of death and dying, his scholarship is routinely cited by leading scholars, clinicians, and practitioners within the field of death studies, and indeed beyond. And there are citations in cognate areas and disciplines across the fields of arts, humanities, and social sciences. His 2008 book on mourning and disaster has been described by an eminent social scientist from the University of Warwick, Professor Deborah Steinberg, as offering an original and deeply resonant cultural analysis of public mourning. Another notable scholar, Professor Richard Johnson from the University of Birmingham, described his book as giving us new insights into the relations of private grief and public remembrance, a key issue for our disaster-stricken times. Professor Grace Davey, an eminent sociologist of religion at the University of Exeter, has described Professor Brennan's work as very creatively bridging the public-private dichotomy that haunts so much of the discussion about death in modern societies. Professor Brennan has edited a number of anthologies, including Theorizing the Popular, published in the year 2017, and the A to Z of Death, Death and Dying, published in the year 2014. The A to Z of Death and Dying is an encyclopedic reference book and essential reference resource for students, scholars, and practitioners whose work brings them into contact with death, dying, and bereavement. Professor Brennan's recent work includes publications on the notion of social death, on the materiality of mourning and the significance of objects in mediating grief, and on the topic of traumatic loss, especially following the Hillsborough disaster and the opening of the new inquests into deaths in that 1989 tragedy. He has also recently published in the area of pathography or public mediated dying, examining the cultural significance as well as the practical and clinical implications of first-person narratives shared by people who are terminally ill. He is currently examining the role of cancer memoirs and their potential role within narrative medicine. Alongside this, Professor Brennan is involved in a project examining the future of dark tourism and the popular interest in touristic visits to sites of death and destruction. His reputation is further underlined by the invitation to join the International Work Group on Death, Dying, and Bereavement. This is a think tank comprised of an international group of clinicians, scholars, and researchers that meets with a view to publishing practical guidelines, principles, and statements of assumption in the field of death, dying, and bereavement. Membership of this by invitation only group is an honor bestowed on him in recognition of his scholarship and leadership within the field. Professor Brennan's leadership experience in higher education extends across 25 years, 2 continents, having worked in the UK and the US, and a number of senior roles, including subject lead for sociology in the School of Social Sciences here at this university, and in his previous role as director of the Center for Death Education and Bioethics at the University of Wisconsin in the US. Professor Brennan is a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy, a member of the British Sociological Association's Heads and Professors Sociology Group, member of the US-based Association for Death Education and Counseling, and member of the British Sociological Association's Study Group on the social aspects of death, dying, and bereavement. He has been an associate editor of Illness, Crisis, and Loss, a prestigious journal, and presently he continues to be on the editorial board. In addition to that, he also sits on the editorial boards of 2 more international journals, Methodological Innovations, and another one called Memory Studies. He contributes to local, national, and international news media on matters relating to death, dying, and bereavement. I can indeed perhaps go on for many more minutes. For example, I know that recently he has published on the theme of sociology in the age of pandemic and why COVID is a social issue. I'm sure this introduction and such a range of achievements give us a clear sense and explain the designation of his personal chair in sociology. So to celebrate his professorship and his achievements, I would now like to invite Professor Brennan to deliver to us his inaugural lecture entitled From Death Denial to Death Doulas, Is Death Having a Moment? Let's find out, Professor Brennan.
Vice-Chancellor, Pro-Vice-Chancellor, thank you. Friends, colleagues, distinguished guests, good evening. It's good to see so many of you, especially on the eve of a bank holiday. It certainly beats the turnout I've been getting for some of my undergraduate lectures of late. Must be the topic. The choice of death and dying as an academic topic is an unusual one, and one that draws some curious responses from people when I tell them what I do as a sociologist of death and dying. I'm often met with puzzled silence, accompanied by a smile and a nod of the head. Other times, with quizzical curiosity about why one would study such a seemingly morbid topic. And on other occasions, it prompts a personal anecdote from people about their own experiences with death and dying. All of these responses are instructive and tell us something about our relationship with death and dying. That it's something people would prefer not to talk about and do not feel properly equipped to deal with. That it's a gloomy topic that might weigh heavily on those who study it. Or alternatively, it perhaps indicates that there's a newfound appetite for people to share their thoughts and personal experiences on a topic that has long been considered taboo or off limits. Over the years, the latter has been an increasingly more common reaction. Such responses include sharing experiences about end-of-life care, sometimes positive, perhaps about how wonderful hospice staff were with a loved one in their final days and weeks, sometimes negative, about how poorly a terminal prognosis was communicated to a loved one by a doctor. More often than not, these shared experiences relate to a person's identity and how people from that person's own faith community or ethnic background deal with death and dying. When I talk about my own research on public mourning following the death of a public figure or disaster, or the recent tendency for public figures to talk openly about their experiences of cancer and dying, people are only too willing to offer up their take on events. We know only too well that death, dying, and bereavement are universal experiences, ones from which we cannot escape. But just how they are experienced differs according to a range of social factors that include social class, gender, ethnicity, age, region, nation, and faith, among others. In a sociological sense, death, dying, and bereavement are what French 19th century sociologist Émile Durkheim would call social facts. And social facts, he suggested, are best explained by other social facts. As a topic that has remained on the margins of sociology, Durkheim was among the first to make inroads in this uncharted terrain. His most seminal work is arguably his landmark study of suicide. Durkheim's major contribution here was to demonstrate that the personal act of taking one's own life had wider structural or social explanations and causes. How well one was integrated in society was considered a reliable indicator of a person's predisposition to suicide, a known risk factor in today's terminology. Suicide, then, for Durkheim, was a social fact that could be explained by other social facts, such as one's social class, religious affiliation, or marital status. In European societies, Durkheim found that Catholics had lower rates of suicide than Protestants. This, he deduced, could be explained by lower levels of social integration among Protestants, who, since the Reformation, had had a direct and unmediated relationship with God. Catholics, in contrast, Durkheim explained, were socially integrated by virtue of the largely communal relationships with God, mediated and fostered by activity centered around the church. It was this that led Austrian sociologist Werner Stark to describe the Calvinist as the lonely man par excellence, and the Catholic as the archetypal social man, the incarnation of the principle that Ferdinand Tönnies called community. Community here is central, both to sociology and to our relationship with death, and a theme I want to revisit throughout this lecture. Death and dying has never been an explicit focus of sociologists. This is somewhat surprising, as death and dying are an intrinsic and inescapable part of life and living. Durkheim's ideas are perhaps the closest we come to early manifestations of death and dying within the classical sociological tradition. Durkheim's ideas on death ritual in his work on the elementary forms of the religious life arguably provide the germinal beginnings for a sociology of death and dying that would later flourish and are only now coming to full fruition. Here, Durkheim illustrated very powerfully the impact an individual death can have on a community, but also the power that community can have in helping to heal the wounds created by loss. In short, Durkheim's ideas show us that death is a powerful engine of social solidarity. We see this typically following individual losses, but also following disasters affecting the wider community. We witnessed powerful examples of this during the COVID pandemic, in the weekly clap for carers that recognised the work of frontline NHS staff and others. We saw too the devastating impact of not being able to gather together in funerary ritual. There is something fundamental and basic in our desire to be with others physically during times of crisis and loss. Before his death in 2020, former Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks recounted an episode from the Invictus Games when one of the participants in a game of wheelchair doubles tennis was momentarily frozen by fear from the sound of a helicopter overhead that had triggered his PTSD. His teammates stopped play to comfort him, and Sacks reminds us of a story from the Talmud, where a faith healer famed for healing others was himself taken ill. The Talmud, Sacks says, asks why the faith healer could not heal himself. The response is simple, that self-care is sometimes not enough, and that we need the support and care of others from the wider community. Community, Sacks says, is where we meet face to face to give each other strength. It's where people know who we are and miss us when we are not there. Community is society with a human face. It's the redemption of our solitude. This quote from Sacks is all the more prescient in light of COVID-19. It reminds us that while virtual technologies have been essential in allowing us to be together while keeping us safely apart, they are no substitute for real, in-person human contact with others. It's fitting too, because this vision of community underpins our ethos at Hope. Durkheim's work provides an important portal on how sociology can help us make sense of death and dying. In my own work, I've made a case for the retention of the classical tradition in sociology in helping us understand contemporary issues. We don't have to dig too deep to see how others from within this tradition can help shed light on issues related to death and dying. Marx's focus, for example, on inequality and social justice can be brought to bear on contemporary issues of funeral poverty, disparities in life expectancy, and the systemic neglect resulting in public tragedy. It was Marx's friend and collaborator, Friedrich Engels, who coined the term social murder in ways that can be readily applied to preventable tragedies such as the Hillsborough disaster of 1989 and the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017. That funeral poverty in an age of affluence continues to exist is a modern-day scandal that should be a concern to all of us. Recent figures on this indicate that nearly 74,000 people in the UK struggled to pay for a funeral in 2018. The shortfall for those who struggle to pay funeral costs has also risen to an all-time high, from £1,744 in 2018 to £1,990 in 2019. Life expectancy also provides a useful barometer, a gauge both on the state of the nation and our global economic system. That life expectancy should be 10 years longer for both men and women in the most affluent areas of major English cities compared to the least affluent, even when sometimes separated by only a few miles, is an indictment on our society. When put in global perspective, the average life expectancy in 2020 of someone living in the Central African Republic of 52 years, compared to the richer nations of the world, where one can expect to live into one's 80s, is a stain on our world economic system, itself a focus of Marx's criticism back when he was writing in the 19th century. Of other sociologists in the classical tradition, Max Weber's insights on the growing rationalization of society, including the insidious spread of bureaucracy, can be applied to death and dying, not least to modern medicine, the modern funeral industry, and end-of-life care. In a disenchanted world, described by Weber as robbed of gods, death and dying in modern times have become technological rather than spiritual matters. Dying in this view becomes simply a technical matter of deciding at what point a person has died in respect of the cessation of various types of bodily function. Modern medicine has extended life, wired to machines and using invasive procedures, but often at considerable cost to the patient, leading some critics to claim that the era of natural death has ended and that the dying person has lost the right to preside over their own act of dying. In similar vein, grief itself has been categorized into various typologies, from absent to abnormal and atypical, to pathological, complicated, and unresolved grief, and others besides. There has also been some concern among sociologists of death and dying that grief itself is being pathologized, turned from a normal aspect of everyday life into a medical condition requiring treatment and medication. Some scholars were particularly concerned by the inclusion of grief in the latest Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the DSM-5, in 2013. The increased popularity of low-cost cremation and growth of multinational funeral companies, such as Service Corporation International, also indicates a trend toward standardized, cost-efficient funerals throughout the second half of the 20th century. Even hospice, founded as an outlier and in opposition to many of the assumptions of modern biomedicine, is itself subject to bureaucratizing pressures in ways that may undermine some of the original philosophy of its founders. Sociological thinkers from the classical era, whose voices have been marginalized until relatively recently, have also contributed to the nascent field of death studies. African-American thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells. Du Bois's analysis of death among African Americans provided an early glimpse into wider structural inequalities of race in US society, as well as deaths resulting from racially motivated violence and state-sanctioned killing. Wells's work on lynchings of African American men and unfounded allegations of rape of white women drew attention to the politics of death and the intersections of race, gender, and sexuality. All of this illustrates how sociology can be successfully brought to bear on our understanding of death, dying, and bereavement. Like society itself, which is in continuous flux, how we experience death, dying, and bereavement are also changing. That grief today can be experienced for a person we have never met face to face also tells us much about how media, celebrity, and online networks function in contemporary society. Technology and other wider social factors like globalization, climate change, and secularization are also changing the way we grieve and die. A person can now tweet daily updates from their deathbed about their demise to a global audience via Twitter, use a VR headset as a non-medical intervention for pain relief as part of palliative care, and can even reconnect with lost loved ones using virtual and augmented reality. A person can now also order a green burial in a woodland cemetery using a biodegradable coffin, or a green cremation using a process of aquamation, and can draw upon countless customs and cultural traditions from around the globe to mark a loved one's death. The Mexican tradition of commemorating ancestors on the Day of the Dead has also, increasingly, in our global culture, been diffused across the world, and has also been commodified and consumed in imagery represented on clothing to car air fresheners. There are important concerns here, both about cultural appropriation and also the sense that deeply meaningful cultural traditions are being hollowed out in the service of fashion and consumption. Nevertheless, these examples illustrate how our relationship with death and dying, in parallel with society itself, is changing and will continue to do so. All of this is a powerful reminder of the social forces surrounding and shaping death, dying, and bereavement. And that is part of the focus of my lecture tonight. The other is to examine whether our relationship with death and dying has come of age and what challenges might lie ahead. Together, I want to make a case for a sociology of death, or to put it another way, to highlight the insights a sociological analysis can bring to our understanding of this most fundamental of human experiences. It's also an opportunity for me to reflect and take stock of my own work in the field of death and dying in the last 20 years or so. When I first started researching death and dying at the end of the 1990s, the field, in this country at least, was in its infancy. Here in the UK, the first symposium on the sociology of death did not take place until 1991, in Leicester, no less. The first academic journal, Mortality, had only just been launched in 1996, and the first university courses on the topic were only introduced in the 1990s. None of the research centres, professional organisations, and networks of researchers that exist today had been established, and there were only a handful of academics in the field writing on the topic. Today, that landscape is very different. In contrast, in the USA, the academic study of death and dying was already relatively well established. Much of this growth had begun in the 1950s. The first symposium on the academic study of death was held in Chicago in 1956, and the first university-level course on death and dying was taught at the University of Minnesota in 1963 by the sociologist Professor Robert Fulton. Fulton also later founded the Center for Death Education in 1969, later renamed the Center for Death Education and Bioethics, which I later had the honor of serving as director of. Meanwhile, the first peer-reviewed academic journal in the field, Omega, Journal of Death and Dying, was founded in 1970, followed in 1977 by Death Studies, under its former name, Death Education. But these developments had not been achieved without considerable struggle. Hermann Feifel, who organised the first symposium on death in 1956, talked about the difficulties he encountered in getting academic approval for university courses on death and dying. Death, he says, was viewed as a topic best left undisturbed, a dark symbol, not to be stirred or touched, an obscenity to be avoided. This reflected prevailing attitudes of the time. And for much of the 20th century, it has often been said that Anglophone societies like Britain and the United States were in the grip of death denial. In effect, such denial was manifested in a conspiracy of silence around death. This resulted in failure to talk openly about the subject, to push it aside. It resulted in a failure to face up to death, to make funeral plans, or prepare for end-of-life decisions, such as organ donation, living wills, or advance directives, setting out our wishes should we be incapacitated and unable to make decisions about our future care. In the UK, new legislation meaning that organ donation following death is now automatic unless we opt out in advance marks a significant departure from previous attitudes and practices around death and dying. The language of death denial owes much to the Freudian psychological tradition in US-based death studies. Here, the unconscious denial about the reality of death functions intuitively as a defense mechanism against the fear and anxiety generated by the thought of death and non-existence. That humans should fear death, the thought of pain caused by dying a bad death, or the fear that comes from not knowing what may happen to us after death, are not unreasonable reactions. We as humans, after all, are unique among all species in knowing that we will die. And this knowledge, as both a blessing and a curse, provides profound problems for the living. The dead have no such problems and are not riddled with existential angst. The work of anthropologists and historians has indicated that humans have always, to varying degrees, experienced these kinds of emotions in relation to death and dying. This relationship is group-specific, varying across historical time and from one society to another. What, however, in the 20th century did appear to mark a significant shift was the unprecedented lengths to which Anglo-Saxon societies would go to in avoiding dealing with death. Such death denial can be seen in the treatment of people who were dying. Doctors and other healthcare professionals would often go to great lengths to conceal information from the dying about their terminal prognosis, often colluding with the families of the dying in order to do so. Informing people of a terminal condition was perceived at the time as likely to cause considerable psychological harm. Back then, in the United States, only 12% of doctors surveyed in the 1960s said they disclosed a terminal diagnosis to patients. But this was beginning to change, and by 1977, some 97% of doctors surveyed said they were fully open with patients about a terminal diagnosis. A similar pattern could be observed in the UK. Denial was also manifested in medical circles as a refusal to accept death. Death was viewed as the enemy, and failure to overcome it was viewed as defeat. This often led to social withdrawal from patients once it was established that nothing more could be done to extend a person's life, frequently resulting in social death, even before biological death had occurred. Early pioneers in the hospice movement on both sides of the Atlantic argued passionately that much more could be done for patients facing a terminal diagnosis. Palliative pain relief and the use of creative arts in end-of-life care has been the lasting legacy of pioneers like Cicely Saunders, founder of the first modern hospice, St. Christopher's, in London in 1967. Saunders argued against attempts at prolonging a person's life, whatever the personal cost, extolling the virtues of hospice as enriching rather than simply extending life, adding life to years, not years to life, as she used to put it. Denial didn't stop with the medical community. It could be found too in the design and planning of new American towns and cities of the mid-20th century. I've even heard it said that one American town at the time was conceived of without consideration of a cemetery or crematorium. And even when provision for the dead was not overlooked altogether from the designs of urban planners, many cemeteries and crematoria were sited at the outer limits of urban areas, where out of sight was also conveniently out of mind. Denial then operated at a structural, institutional, and wider cultural level. What, in the medieval tradition of ars moriendi, or the art of dying, had once been a community event where family and friends would gather around the deathbed to say their farewells, had now been sequestered behind closed doors. Even before the COVID pandemic, hospital in the UK was still the main place of death for most people. By the 21st century, 3/4 of people in the UK would draw their last breath in hospital. Contrast this with the situation at the beginning of the 20th century, when most people died at home. As the 20th century progressed, and as technical specialization and the division of labor in society increased, responsibility for care of the dead and dying was increasingly delegated to others. This included the responsibility for the storage, internment, and disposal of dead bodies. Those who originally undertook responsibility to make coffins and caskets for the deceased gradually evolved into modern-day undertakers. In outsourcing this responsibility to others, we have in turn become more remote and removed from death as an inevitable part of everyday human life. Laying out the dead, a responsibility we once assumed ourselves, has thus become the responsibility of others. In so doing, we relinquished our once intimate relationship with death, the dead and the dying, becoming further removed from an experience and process we were once well acquainted with. Critics of the American funeral industry in the 20th century, the high watermark of a period of death denial, rounded on the practices and euphemisms that, in their view, reinforced our detachment from death. Here, funeral directors were morticians, professionals trained in mortuary science that involved the widespread practice of embalming, a practice far less common in the UK and traced in the US to the Civil War and the extended period of time needed for the repatriation of Union soldiers killed in battle in the South to northern states. The science and art of embalming involves creating a memory picture of the deceased for open casket funerals and visitations, so that they can be remembered as they were in the midst of life, not in the throes of death. But this too can be seen as a form of denial, denying the reality of aging and bodily deterioration. In this country, commentators have been less likely to talk in terms of denial than sequestration. Some bemoaned the decline of organized religion in the 20th century as leaving people without the wherewithal to navigate death, dying, and bereavement. Writing in the mid-1960s, Geoffrey Gorer pointed to practicing Jews as an example of a faith community guided or signposted in their mourning by prescribed practices and calendrical waypoints. Gorer was writing just before the widespread immigration of other faith communities from South Asian countries, who brought with them their traditions and practices for helping navigate death, dying, and bereavement. It was Anglo-Saxon communities in particular that Gorer had his eye on. In an increasingly secular age, Gorer was concerned that these groups were lacking the folkways or better still, deathways to navigate grief. Gora's work is significant, for alongside his extended work on mourning, he wrote an influential essay in 1955. In it, he claimed that cultural representations of death were distorted and were akin to a kind of pornography, lurid, cheap, and nothing like what death and dying were like in reality. I'll come back to this briefly in assessing where I think we are now in our relationship with death and dying, but for now I want to focus briefly on the academic study of death, dying, and bereavement. As we've seen, the academic study of death and dying is a multidisciplinary pursuit. Psychologists, historians, anthropologists, theologians, philosophers, and specialists in palliative care are among those involved in death studies. Sociologists were involved from the outset. Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss's hospital ethnographies in the 1960s were significant in highlighting death as a social process, especially the ways in which people learned how to die. That's to say, learned the appropriate behavior based on what information was revealed to them by medical staff. Around the same time, David Sudnow's hospital ethnography revealed how medical efforts at resuscitation depended upon the social characteristics of the patients being treated. Those whose lives were deemed less worthy, such as the homeless, or whose illness was perceived to be self-inflicted, like drug addicts and alcoholics, were given less care and attention in resuscitative efforts than others who fitted a more normative model. In short, Sudnow found that certain groups were already treated as if they were dead. They were, in other words, socially dead. Yet despite being at the forefront of nascent death studies, it's psychologists, not sociologists, who have tended to dominate death studies in the United States, where it's often referred to as thanatology, after Thanatos, the personification of death in Greek mythology. The term thanatology has never quite caught on in the UK. In the United States, where I taught for a number of years, the term has been more widely embraced. Being an outsider or stranger often gives us a unique perspective, and my time in the US allowed me to reflect upon the differences and divergent paths that death studies has taken in the UK and US. In the US, death studies has tended to be taught in universities and schools with a more general set of humanistic goals as death education. The core assumption being that learning about death and dying can enrich our lives, helping us to appreciate them as finite while preparing us for losses we should expect to experience over a lifetime. It summons to mind the words of the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates, who is reported to have said that the really important point is not to live, but to live well. Thanatology in the US operates on the assumption that we can all benefit from knowing how to support colleagues, friends, and family who are grieving, or may have experienced some other kind of loss. It's grounded in a compassionate, caring ethos. No bad thing. In the UK, death studies has tended to be grounded in more broadly sociological terms and aims, retaining not only a disciplinary base, but also a critical edge. Advocates of this approach have cautioned against a pan-disciplinary thanatology that, as an area of academic special interest, is both insular and cut off from any kind of disciplinary base, warning against the dangers of a thanatological ghetto that speaks only to itself. There's value, I think, in both approaches. In an approach that champions compassionate communities and self-care, as well as one that's not afraid to take a critical position towards developments, whether in the field of palliative care, bereavement studies, or society more generally. Adopting a critical stance that might challenge some of the assumptions and practices of stakeholders on whom we depend for funding or access to the field is not always easy and is a delicate balance to strike. At the same time, I think there's a strong case to be made for weaving a focus on mortal life into sociology, while using our sociological training to illustrate how a focus on death can tell us a great deal about society and wider social issues. Inadequate provision or unequal access to hospice care, the deaths of young black men while in police custody, or tragedies caused by systematic neglect of public infrastructure are personal troubles which are encountered most directly by the individuals and families involved. But they are also, as American sociologist C. Wright Mills would remind us, public issues with underlying social causes and wider structural implications. I want to finish tonight's lecture by looking at where we are now, to examine how far we've come in recent years, to assess future challenges, and consider whether death and dying are indeed having a moment. The terrain is vast, so I'll limit my reflections to 3 areas in particular: mourning, dying, and talk about death and dying. I'll start with mourning, which is where my journey in death and dying began. Hillsborough and the widespread public mourning on Merseyside that followed it is what first piqued my interest in the topic. Here was an event, widespread public mourning, that received widespread media coverage that seemed absolutely extraordinary at the time. Floral tributes, condolence books, the interweaving of football memorabilia and religious iconography, ecumenical remembrance services, the ringing of the city's cathedral bells 95 times, a mile-long scarf link between Anfield and Goodison, and a pilgrimage to Anfield, Liverpool FC's spiritual home, attended by more than 1 million people. All of this had the hallmarks of a watershed moment. Some put this down to Scouse sentimentality. Other, more learned explanations pointed to Liverpool's expressivism as rooted in its Irish Celtic traditions. Within less than a decade, reminiscent scenes were seen following the death of Princess Diana in 1997, this time in London, not Liverpool. This, like the outpouring of grief on Merseyside, was not to everyone's liking. Some thought it odd that people should be moved to grieve for a person they had never met in person and did not know. Others complained of feeling fascism, that they felt undue pressure to conform to behaviour that confirmed the idea of a nation in grief. Many complained that they simply did not feel that way. Others, on the other hand, explained that Diana spoke to a rainbow constituency of marginalised voices: gay men, people of colour, the socially excluded, in ways that extended beyond and defied straightforward deference to royalty. Others still explained that the grief was media-fueled, or that celebrity can be a powerful resource in shaping and supporting identity. Fans of Diana, they claimed, were responding to the loss of an icon and the loss of an affective relationship, however distant. Both events were seen as unprecedented, but historians pointed to a long-forgotten tradition of public mourning in early modern England, when the lord of the manor would pay local paupers a dole of bread to attend his funeral so as to swell the numbers, and with it, his seeming importance. Others still pointed to non-Western societies in which communal mourning, even for others not known to us personally, is commonplace. After a century or so of silence in which grief had been repressed or privatized, both events appeared to signal the revival of death. That revival has continued, not least in wayside shrines following road traffic accidents, but also in a whole range of commemorative practices that appear to signal the end of death denial. RIP tattoos, death cafes, death doulas, a self-styled death positivity movement, all appear to indicate a rather different relationship with death and dying. A signal, perhaps, that our relationship with death has come of age and is having a moment. So what of this idea? It seems no longer tenable that we can plausibly entertain the idea that death in the 21st century is denied. Since it was founded in 2011 as a not-for-profit social franchise intended to increase awareness of death with a view to helping people make the most of their finite lives, some 13,500 death cafes have taken place in 81 countries across the globe. So too, many more people are choosing to enlist the help and support, whether emotional, psychological, or spiritual, of death doulas in the final hours or days of their lives. Just as doulas have been employed to help support women during the labour of childbirth, so increasingly people are turning to death doulas as end-of-life soul companions to accompany them on their final journey from this life. In bringing my lecture to a close, I want to make a few final observations. First, that we need to be careful not to confuse media and social media noise for reality. This may paint a false picture of what is actually happening. And this, of course, is where research data is needed. Data that tells us what is happening regarding current attitudes and practices surrounding death, dying, and bereavement. Death, I'm fairly certain, is having a moment. But there are huge challenges still, including encouraging people to talk more about death and in supporting people to die well. The two are interrelated, and one implication of not talking about death is that we may well miss out on vital care at the end of life. Recent research data from Cardiff University, commissioned by Marie Curie, suggests that 51% of people in the UK still think we don't talk about death enough. More worryingly, data from this 2021 survey indicates that a third of people in the UK are unfamiliar with terms such as palliative or hospice care, and that 53% did not recognise the term living will. Unfamiliarity is even more profound with the term advanced directive, the term for describing the written documentation expressing one's healthcare wishes should a person be unable to communicate them. Here, 87% of people said they had not heard of the term. More worryingly still, 55% of people who are in the last years of their lives said they did not know where to find information about making advanced care plans. This is a measure of the task at hand and the work still needed in developing the public conversation around death and dying. Finally, if death is indeed having a moment and has moved out of the shadows from a low point of Western death denial, then we need to seize this moment in ways that allow us to continue the conversation, but also, crucially, to make good on it by building compassionate communities of mutual care and support, giving people the tools of self-care, and by learning to incorporate death within life as many non-Western cultures have done for centuries. Thank you.
Well, that's a fascinating 45 minutes. Thank you, Professor Brennan. You and I will take our seats and we'll let the head of school, Professor Michael Levelet, make a response formally. Michael.
Thank you.
afraid of my age, I have to get my glasses out. Please give me a few moments. Okay, Vice-Chancellor, honoured guests, Mike's family, colleagues and friends, it's my honour and privilege to respond to Mike's professorial lecture. And I want to start by offering my congratulations to Professor Brennan for a really enlightening and fantastic talk. One that emphasises the long sociological and anthropological interest in the topic of death and dying, a topic that too often is not discussed in polite company, as Mike has emphasised, or it's left to colleagues in the medical sciences or theology. Before I start, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself and Chris Leyland, who's the University Executive Officer, because when people become professors at the university, they then go and talk to the Vice-Chancellor about the title that they will take. And I'm really pleased that Mike has come back with the title of Professor of Sociology, because we were terrified it was going to be Professor Death. But luckily that's not what he chose. So before we got on to the sort of main part, I just wanted to thank Mike really for being a good colleague and a friend within the School of Social Sciences. I really got to know Mike when the sociology team at the university joined the expanding School of Social Sciences in 2018. And he led the integration of sociology into the new school, set about redesigning the curriculum with enthusiasm, and took on a lead role as we were preparing for the latest ref round. As I got to know Mike better, I realised that we have much in common, including our love of sport. Mike loves both tennis, which he regularly plays, and football. But of course, in terms of football, we don't have much in common. I support a side of winners who regularly compete at the highest levels in Europe. Mike supports a team from Sheffield, who I assume by their name play their best efforts on a Wednesday, which is really unfortunate because most games are on a Saturday. But in any case, I'd like to thank him for his support and his friendship over the years, and for the role that he's played in the school. So now to the main part of my response, and this has given me some anxiety because this year I have been really lucky enough to listen to a number of fantastic professorial talks, and I've always been impressed when my learned colleagues stand up and give the response. Professor McGrail, Professor Cuthbertson in particular, have included quotations from scripture or from the English literary canon, and where they've managed to link the subject under discussion with a famous or insightful quotation. So I must say this has put some pressure on me to do something similar, and I've spent considerable time over the last few days wondering how I could possibly do this. How could I get death and dying literary reference into my talk? I initially thought about starting my talk rather differently, a quick adaptation of Shakespeare perhaps, and I could start with Vice-Chancellor, honoured guests, colleagues and friends. I come to praise Mike, not to bury him, but I thought better of that. I then wondered about throwing in a story, and especially given Mike's love of tennis, I thought I could tell you the story about the funeral that I went to just a couple of weeks ago. It was a friend's funeral. He died after he'd been hit in the head with a tennis ball during a match. It was a lovely service. However, when I passed over my talk to Helen Byrne, who's my PA, and to Chris Leyland, the University Executive Officer, and I asked them to read over my speech, they both warned me against being so crass and put terrible jokes in, especially as they said it wasn't funny. I was then panicking, so I thought, well, I was going to ask Andy Cattrall. Andy Cattrall always sits up the back at these events. He's the head of personnel. And I thought, well, what I could do is I could ask Andy to constantly clear his throat during Mike's talk, and this would set me up perfectly for saying, I hope you weren't put off by the coffin at the back. So, maybe for some of us, the jokes don't fit because death and dying are often treated as taboo subjects. However, as Mike's talk points out, the process of death is full of sociological concerns. It is both a natural and a social process. Sociologically, it will be affected, shaped, and experienced differently, depending on our social position and by the impact of inequalities, by cultural practices and understandings, by ritual and taboo, and all of these are invested with social meaning. Let me draw on my own research and experiences to highlight two examples that I have reflected on after reading Mike's talk and preparing for today. You may not know, but for a long period I was a local government councillor. And in 2008, just before I started at Liverpool Hope, I got a call from a friend about a tragic event that had taken place in my ward. The previous night, a young Muslim man had been attacked and killed in a racist murder. I immediately went to the family and spent much of the following week with them. And what became apparent was that their grief was shaped by a number of different social elements. First, of course, the sudden loss of a dear grandson, son, brother, nephew, and perhaps on this level, this sudden loss is something that we can all relate to. But second, this was a murder. It was the result of a violent act, a far less common event and far more difficult for us to understand what the family were going through. Third was the racist element. This young man was killed in an atmosphere of growing Islamophobia. It impacted his family and his community, and it served locally as an exemplar of yet another violent racist act in a northwest town in England. Finally, there was a clash between state requirement and cultural norms. The state required an autopsy. The state required the body to be kept in case the defence wanted a second opinion. Now, these might seem logical or important in legal terms, but of course they clash with Muslim expectations for a quick funeral. In Islam, it is considered that after a person passes away, their soul has passed on and their body will return to Allah. Those that are living have responsibilities to support them to return back to Allah, and the expectation is that the intact body of their son would be interned in the ground in the state in which it was born into this world, and it would do so as quickly as possible. And therefore the autopsy and the delay caused extreme anxiety for the family. In this case then, questions of racism, religion, culture, legal practice, state regulation surrounded the question of death and brought death firmly into the sociological fold, as Mike has emphasised. My second example comes from my research in Palestine and concerns the case of the Shahid or the Martyr. Whenever you're in the West Bank or Gaza, you don't have to go very far before you come across a poster of a Shahid. The term martyr applies to any of those killed by Israeli guns or bombs, or anyone killed in direct combat with occupation forces. The death of a martyr is a painful loss to family, friends, and community. But it's also full of social and political meaning. The great Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish described the funeral procession of the Palestinian martyr as akin to a wedding celebration. In his poem, Praise for a Thing That Did Not Arrive, he celebrates the Palestinian martyr and presents their death as an endless wedding procession. He says, "This is the wedding that never ends, in a battlefield that has no end, on a night that never ends. This is the Palestinian wedding, where lover never reaches beloved, except as a martyr or a refugee." The notion of a wedding celebration is not something that we would immediately spring to our mind when we think about violent death. But Darwish's point was that in death, the martyr was returned, was married to his or her lost homeland. The funeral event then became a political ceremony where there are speeches, where there are poetry is read, and sometimes where the dabka is danced, as the community celebrates both the life and the death of one of their own. Again, these examples, these demand a sociological understanding. The funeral ceremony as a political marriage can only be understood within the context of displacement and colonial settlement in Palestine. In these examples, after reading Mike's work, I could reflect back on the sociological relevance of death and dying as social processes, the core element of Mike's work as a public sociologist. Mike's work gets us to think about what it means to be human, what it means to be social animals, and about how our lives and our death are shaped in part by social processes. Mike's work is helping to bring these elements of sociology to a wider audience and to embed it as a central concern of sociology and to place Liverpool Hope University sociology on the map. It just remains for me to thank Mike once again and to congratulate him on his position of Professor of Sociology, not Death, at Liverpool Hope University.
Thank you very much, Professor Lovelett, for that response. As Professor Brennan was speaking, the quote from Freud came to mind. I could still hear my old professor say, quoting Freud, who said, "Men have illusions about their immortality. They never come to terms with their own death." And what Freud was intending, Michael, as you know, was not to make us focus on the morbid, but if we come to terms with our own death, we'll then have a sense of what it means to be human and to live. And Dr. Sue's question is, what then is a good death? Will be the question, what then is a good life? Because we don't postpone the inevitable until, of course, time flies away, and then it's too late. Thank you for a most stimulating evening. And may I invite you forward to accept this little gift as a memento of tonight, Michael, and congratulations. Wasn't that good? I'm going to invite Professor Brennan and his wife and daughter even, if you want to go to the door first to greet our friends as they leave. Thank you, Michael. If you can go ahead, yes.